Good evening and welcome to the Civility Theater. If you've been here before, you might notice that things look a little different tonight. We're experiencing some technical difficulties with the orchestra pit, so we have had to be a bit creative with our setup. We truly appreciate your understanding and flexibility. As they say, the show must go on. Now we turn our program over to College of Charleston President Andrew Shue.
By the way, I'm not the speaker today, so thank you though for your welcome. Good evening, everyone. So good to see all of you here. I'm Andrew Shue, president of the College of Charleston. It's my distinct honor to welcome everyone to the College of Charleston and to the beautiful Civility Theater. I have to first apologize for the format. Those of you who are in the back may find it a little difficult to see the speaker today because we have a water issue and the stage is not safe to use tonight, so sorry. So tonight, of course, is our Civility Initiative series, and it's co-sponsored by the College of Charleston's Civility Initiative and the Department of Communication. And the subject is certainly one that has commanded the headlines in recent days, the polarization of America. The director of the College of Charleston's Civility Initiative is Dr. Mike Lee, a professor of communication who specializes in the area of political communication and rhetoric. His books have explored the rise of conservatism as well as the country's philosophy around secession and separation. Our city is certainly no stranger to those topics. For our students present tonight, you may have taken one of Professor Lee's courses on eloquence, public speaking, persuasive messaging, or media and politics. If you haven't, I strongly encourage you to do so next semester or in the fall. Professor Lee is joined by our featured guest today, Mr. Jamelle Bouie, an opinion columnist for the New York Times. Mr. Bouie has been with the New York Times for 5 years and has written much on our current political landscape. Mr. Jamelle Bouie was born and raised in Virginia and earned a Bachelor of Arts degree in political and social thought and government from the University of Virginia. As I understand that Mr. Bouie's parents are now here in the greater Charleston area. Can you stand up and let's give you a big round of applause. Thank you. Thanks for joining us. So early in Mr. Bouie's career, he was a staff writer for the Daily Beast and then served as chief political correspondent for the Slate. You may recognize him from CBS News, where he was a political analyst, or you may have seen him on Face the Nation, where he is a frequent guest. Or you may have recognized his voice from his podcast, Unclear and Present Danger, where he talks about the 90s post-Cold War thrillers. Regardless of your political affiliation, tonight's discussion will certainly help us to better understand last week's election and the current political landscape in America. While the topic may be about polarization, I hope we can all find common ground together as we seek to better understand the world around us. Please join me in welcoming Professor Mike Lee and Mr. Jamelle Bouie.
Hi. How y'all doing? Jamelle, anything in the news you want to talk about?
No, nothing big happened. I don't know.
Okay, well, it's going to be a short show, and you get what you pay for. Let's start short-term election stuff, then we'll project into the future, we'll go into the deep past, and we'll try to cover this thing from every possible angle. Let's start on a personal note. You work for the Times, have a prominent position observing and talking about American politics. What were you surprised by in the result of the election? What were you not surprised by?
First, let me say thank you to the College of Charleston for having me. Thank you to everyone for coming out, to my parents for coming out. I heard that they had welcomed you. What was I surprised by? So my colleague at the Times, Nate Cohn, runs basically the Times' polling division, and his perspective all through this was more or less, it's very close, and depending on which way the polling error tilted would more or less determine the outcome. And that was sort of my perspective as well. I had made no predictions on who was going to win or who was going to lose, and just figured if there was polling error, which there would be, that would determine who was going to win. Went 2 or 3 points red, the former president would win. Went 2 or 3 points blue, the vice president would win, and it went 2 or 3 points red. I'll say the things that surprised me, especially now as we have more precinct-level results, is that there was a pretty significant red swing in urban areas. Mm-hmm. Actually, let me step back. The thing that surprised me was that the former president did win the national popular vote, and it'll end up being quite slim, about less than the point, but that will make President Trump the first Republican to win the national popular vote in 20 years, and only 2 Republicans to do so since 1988. Mm-hmm. So I think that's quite significant. I'm not sure necessarily what it means going forward, but it is a significant difference. And then, these changes in urban areas, the fact that down ballot, Democrats actually appear to do pretty decently. They didn't hold the Senate. It's unclear who has the House, but this wasn't, when you look at the full picture, this wasn't a wipeout. It was a modest Republican win. But it's going to be a modest Republican win with big consequences.
Let's do some Monday morning quarterbacking, as it were, and talk about why what happened. And we'll start on the Trump side, and then we'll go to the Harris side. So I'm going to ask sort of a deceptively simple question, which is, why did Trump win? And then a deceptively simple question, why did Harris lose? But what I'm also curious about is there's a lot of prevailing theories of the case that you've engaged with and that we've all engaged with. And I'm curious to hear which of those theories hold the most weight to you. So let's start with Trump.
I'll say, actually, to frame all of this, the one thing I'm always incredibly skeptical of, that I just have no time for, are explanations that amount to, if only they had done what I think is right, then they would have won. Or if only they would have done, or didn't do this thing, then they would have won. Anything that seems or appears to be rooted in one's own sort of beliefs about the whole way the world works, I'm kind of skeptical of when it comes to election explanations. Because I think the thing to remember is that the electorate is huge. The United States is a huge country. Probably around 145 million people will have voted, and it's genuinely difficult to make any kind of broad conclusions about the behavior of 145 million people and their reaction to the campaigns. So with that said, when it comes to why Trump won, I think the first explanation has to be to stop looking at the U.S. specifically and look at the world at large. And globally, any political party that was in power after the pandemic, during and after the pandemic, and especially during the pandemic inflation of 2021 and 2022, any party that was in power at that point they've lost a bid for re-election.
Do you have examples of that?
The Tories in the UK, Macron's party in France lost a ton of seats. It's still in power because of the weird coalition that was built, but certainly that party lost a bunch of seats. Even in even more authoritarian figures like Modi in India, his party suffered a big defeat. The Liberal Democratic Party in Japan, and to be clear, in Japan, the Liberal Democratic Party is the more conservative party.
How much fun is that?
Yeah, it's once you leave American politics, all the names stop making sense to Americans, which is what matters. And so in Japan, the ruling party lost seats. I mean, it's sort of a consistent thing. And so I think if you look at it from a global perspective, your actual prior going into this should have been the Democrats were probably favored to lose.
The sort of structural incentives towards voters tilted to the right, or anti-incumbency.
Right,
I've heard this argument several times now, but I'm curious about the why of it. So we come back to this sort of deceptively simple question: is why are people all over the world rejecting incumbency post-COVID?
So first is people hate inflation. People really hate inflation. Even if the pandemic inflation was relative to, say, the inflation of the 70s, pretty modest, it was still a level of inflation that consumers had not experienced in 2 generations. And it's coming after a period of historically low inflation during the 2010s. And in the context of a political economy almost designed around preventing inflation, right? Like we have allowed wages to stagnate, we've allowed unemployment to be high, all to avoid inflation.
Right.
And so a sudden, unavoidable burst of inflation just made people very upset. I also think, and this is a little less quantitative, it's a little more qualitative, I think that there is this sort of post-pandemic malaise that is hard to really say exactly what it is, but a sense that the world after the pandemic is deficient in a way that it wasn't before the pandemic. And this is articulated and explained in many different ways, but it's a real feeling. I'll say something that is American specific, that maybe it's tied up in all of this, is I think there's a feeling that people have that they just don't have enough money to feel comfortable, even if they're doing well. And so all taken together, it's not a good period, not a good year for incumbents. And then when you consider that the former president was president during the period that people thought they were doing better, was president during a period where they felt more comfortable, was president in a period before this kind of catastrophe that happened, it almost, like if you take away the personalities and just put it that way, it's like, yeah, well, of course the person won. Right. It makes perfect sense that they would win. And I think you can make a good case that if it were a different Republican nominee, someone who did not have the same baggage that Trump had going into the election, that person would have won in a totally unconvincing landslide.
Well, let's stay with that. Let's stay with a local example, and then we'll get back to the Harris and Trump kind of Monday morning quarterbacking, what mattered in the campaign and what didn't. If what I'm hearing you say is correct, and that there's kind of economic and psychological malaise circumstances that are international, that are influencing votes and anti-incumbency feelings, then somebody who didn't necessarily have the negatives that Trump has with many voters could have won a landslide, as you said. So Nikki Haley, for instance.
Right.
How do you think Nikki Haley, as a complete counterfactual, would have done versus a Harris or a Biden?
I am 100% certain that if Nikki Haley were the nominee, people would have tuned out the election a month ago because they'd be like, yeah, she's about to be president, right? Like, people would just assume she's about to be president. There was some polling done last year when Biden was still in the race, and it was like, what does a Biden-Haley matchup look like? And it was like Biden losing by 15 points. It was something truly catastrophic for the Democrats. And so I don't know, depending on your perspective, you may call this funny, you may call this interesting, but Democrats were in a tough position going into this. Trump is probably the only candidate that they could have beaten. But even that would have taken an inside straight for Democrats to do, and they just couldn't manage it.
So to that end, then, there's not, in your mind, there's not a lot of weight to be placed on this or that strategy from the Harris campaign. In other words, no more people on the ground in Pennsylvania. Should Tim Walz have been the VP nominee? Did the convention have the correct theme? All of these kinds of micro questions, irrelevant.
Yeah, I don't think any of those things can explain kind of the general swing, right? Like maybe she picks Josh Shapiro to be her VP and not Tim Walz, and maybe that gets her a half a percentage point or a percentage point in Pennsylvania, but she lost Pennsylvania by 3 points.
Yeah,
so,
and if she had won Pennsylvania, does that matter?
Right. No. Maybe she makes a definitive break with President Biden on Gaza and Israel and turns against him on that completely, and maybe that wins her enough votes to hold Michigan, but she still loses Nevada and Arizona and Georgia and North Carolina, right? Sort of anything you can choose, maybe it makes a difference on the margins, but the sweep, the uniform swing to Republicans makes it difficult for me to say she would have won had she done that. And you can't rerun the election. So
no. Let's say for a moment that we can assume that some strategic errors or advantages would have moved the needle a little bit. This is a change election, as you've said. And so many people showed up thinking, well, who is the biggest change agent in this election? And they opted for the former President Trump. What did the Trump campaign do to align themselves more clearly with the theme of change? And what did the Harris campaign potentially was deficient at aligning themselves in a change election?
I'll answer the question with Harris first and then Trump. I think the biggest issue for Harris is just that she couldn't separate herself from the president, right? There was, maybe because it was too late, for Biden to drop out. For whatever reason, it was very difficult for Harris to mark herself as like definitively different from the incumbent administration. For her to have done that, she would have had to essentially run against Biden. And I'm not sure that there is, I'm actually not sure that there is a plausible world in which that would have happened, regardless of who the nominee was. Because it's an unusual thing to happen, right? Like political parties don't really run against their own incumbent presidents. Even, at this point, people pretend like George W. Bush was a president. Republicans act like he never existed. But even Republicans don't really run against Bush. They just ignore him. They pretend like that isn't part of the recent history. And they were doing that in 2008 and 2012. It's hard to imagine a Democratic nominee, whether it's Harris, whether it's anyone, treating Biden as someone to run against, especially since from the perspective of many Democrats, right, like Biden's management of the post-pandemic economy was what they wanted to see. They didn't want high unemployment, like after the recession in 2007, 2008. Like it was a considered policy choice to allow for inflation versus high unemployment, and then Biden helped get passed into law, big climate bill, some infrastructure stuff. Like these are things Democrats liked, and so it leaves you in a tough position, right? Run against the incumbent who did things that I like, but like people don't like him, and I think I'm not sure there's a Democratic politician skilled enough to really thread that needle. And then for Trump, as far as him being a change agent, I don't know if anything he necessarily said had to do with that. I think it's mainly like image and persona. First of all, he's just not in office. He's not the incumbent, so that allows him to be changed. But also his bombast, his sort of still celebrity-ish kind of persona, this kind of, occasional public buffoonery, like these things all together make him appear to be substantively different from existing politicians. And it's like a powerful political tool. He can kind of be a blank slate for people to project on in a lot of ways, which feels weird because it's like, everyone knows who Donald Trump is, but everyone knows him as a celebrity. And Donald Trump, the politician, the leader of the Republican Party, is not as well defined, I think, to a lot of voters. So you can just project on him. And I think that's what happened.
The Republicans had a primary, and it was really a kind of domination ritual with Trump really sweeping the field, with Haley being the last person standing, but DeSantis was so well-funded and never seemed to stand much of a chance, arguably among the biggest flameouts in primary history, speaking in the modern campaign era, is Ron DeSantis of this election season. Counterfactually, so much has been, we're going to come to a question about what is Biden's legacy, so this is a setup to that. What happens in a world where Biden steps aside 6 or 8 months ahead of time? The Democrats have a more or less proper primary season. Perhaps a changed candidate emerges from the pack who can more credibly run against the existing administration as a Democrat. Feasible, not feasible?
I don't know. I honestly do not have a good answer to that question. There are certainly plenty of Democrats who want to be president, and there would be people who'd be running in that election, in that hypothetical primary election. But I still think they get caught up on how do you treat Biden? It's worth thinking about this in the context of a politician running to succeed a 2-term administration, right? So if you're George H.W. Bush in 1988, if you're Al Gore in 2000, if you're Hillary Clinton in 2016, if you're John McCain in 2008, part of your message is you reelected my fellow partisan to 2 terms as president. If you elect me, I'll continue the job. All the things you liked about the last guy,
continuity.
I'll keep doing them. I'm running as an extension of their legacy. If you are on the opposite party in that kind of situation, you can say, I'm running to turn the page, right? I'm running to provide a different path for the United States. But if you're running essentially for the incumbent's second term, you can't take either path, right? You can try to do, this is continuity, but if it's continuity, then why isn't that guy running, right? If this is continuing the previous administration, well, why isn't he the nominee? Right. And it's because he's unpopular. Why is he unpopular? Because people don't like the current path. So you have to differentiate yourself. But if you say, I'm going to run against him, then it's like, what? I'll just vote for the other guy. Like, if I want to vote against the incumbent, there's like this whole other party I can vote for that really will be a different path. And you would have to be just an incredibly skilled politician to navigate that. And even then, it just seems too hard.
We have this kind of whipsaw effect post-COVID, it sounds like internationally as well, which you're educating us well on. Trump will be facing that as soon as he is in office. And so let's talk a little bit about the upcoming Trump administration. So he's facing anti-incumbency, he's term limited in a sense, and so he comes in as a, quote, lame duck presidency, and also is likely to claim a massive mandate, as many would-be presidents are likely to do, and he's no exception to that. Whether that is true in the numbers is sort of being borne out in real time, but it felt like a red wave election in the moment, and certainly over the past week, maybe that's dwindled a bit, but the red wave seems like a very powerful emotional sentiment towards Trump, if not Trumpism. So take us through a little bit of the headwinds, both for Trump in terms of the political headwinds he's riding, and then against him from the anti-incumbency internationally.
Yeah. I think before I talk about Trump, I think it's really worth, you mentioned mandate, I think it's really worth kind of emphasizing that there's kind of no such thing as a mandate. Yeah. This is a thing that politicians certainly claim, political observers will say things, if you turn on CNN or MSNBC or Fox, say, well, he has a mandate to do X, Y, or Z. But I'm of the view that this doesn't exist. This is a construct that we impose on election results. I say that for 2 reasons. The first is a little more airy and theoretical, which is that an electorate is simply too big to attribute a singular thing to it. If Trump wins, he will have won. I mean, if Trump won. Now that Trump has won, my brain is still a week and a half ago. He will have won. He won.
Did he win? He won.
He won. With 71.2 million votes, right? Mm-hmm. All 71.2 million of those people they're not the same kind of person. This is a vast group of people who are voting for reasons maybe common to groups, maybe a little idiosyncratic. I mean, it'll take a lot of time, like actual time and study, to even begin to figure out why the electorate chose what it chose, why it did this, and why it didn't do that. And when you acknowledge the diversity of any kind of electoral coalition, you have to sort of acknowledge that it's very difficult for a president to say, well, they all wanted me to do one thing. They wanted you to do a bunch of different things. To give an historical example, there are three 20th century elections that really stand out for kind of the size and scope of the victory. In 1936, FDR wins re-election and more or less wipes out the Republican Party nationally. Like there effectively is not a viable Republican Party in the United States at that point.
Yeah.
2 years later, Democrats suffered terrible losses in the midterm elections, right? FDR wins that election, immediately says we're going to expand the Supreme Court because the court isn't going to allow New Deal programs to survive. And there's such a backlash to this that it no pun intended, crippled the rest of his administration.
You brought your good material tonight.
Yeah, I know. Waka, waka, waka. So FDR claimed a mandate, but that didn't really materialize, right? Like that didn't really mean anything for him. Lyndon Johnson, defeats Barry Goldwater in the 1964 election. Again, appears to have this great mandate, and the first 2 years afterwards does pass a lot of Great Society legislation. By the end of his term, he has dropped out of the presidential race because he's so deeply unpopular over Vietnam. But also there is this backlash in 1966. Republicans do quite well in those midterm elections. Things are already turning against him. And then Nixon, who wins in 72 in this great landslide, 2 years later has resigned the presidency, right? Presidents can claim mandates, but the public had to own sort of sense of what it wants. It often does not want dramatic change. It often wants continuity with the past, but like continuity maybe with like a different face somewhat. And so looking at this election, Donald Trump won and won the majority popular vote, but he did not win. This is not like a landslide victory, right? This is a very modest win. But he has a lot of ambitions. The people around him have a lot of ambitions. They want to do a lot, as is typical for incoming administrations. But the voters who put him there, to put him in the position to do this, maybe they were just voting because, hey, maybe groceries will be cheaper, housing costs will be cheaper, gas will be a little cheaper, and that's all we want. We want more or less continuity, except things are cheaper. Mm-hmm. And so the question looking forward is, there's this gap between what the public that voted for Trump, or what some of the public that voted for Trump thought they were buying, what Trump and his administration hoped to deliver, and if what they hoped to deliver ends up being too ambitious, too fast, too unpopular, they'll run into the exact same kind of trouble that every single ambitious president runs into within a few years. And we can kind of go down the list, like Obama, huge win in 2008, big backlash in 2010, right? This is a very typical thing.
You brought up one of my favorite stories in the history of American politics is Barry Goldwater after George McGovern lost the biggest landslide in 72, and Barry Goldwater obviously was defeated by massive margins in 64. They're both senators together, and Barry leaves McGovern a note that says, "Dear George, if you're going to lose big. Love, Barry." And I just adore that story. And on those lines, you mentioned these three historic elections. There's been a lot in the news over the past several years, in fact, but especially with the Democrats and turmoil this year with Biden stepping aside, the convention in Chicago, a lot of precedents of what this election reminds us of. 1968 comes up a lot. I know you've talked a bit about 2004 corollaries. What comes up for you when we talk about elections that this election reminds you of, both dynamics and in terms of results?
Right. I mean, in terms of results, this does feel a lot like 2004. I think it's because of the presence of an incumbent president on the ballot. winning another term, obviously not consecutive, but the same kind of narrow Republican victory, big ideological ambitions. It feels very 2004 in that regard. Even some of the same cast of characters, I believe Trump's campaign manager ran the 2004 campaign, so it feels very similar. I was always skeptical of analogies in 1968, just because there was simply there was no, 68 had the Vietnam War, which is this major fracture in American society that really did structure the entire election. And then when you have the assassinations of King, the assassination of Robert Kennedy, it's not, 68 was, I think, it's a very unique year that I'm not sure it's the appropriate analogy. 2004, you know, the background conditions of discontent with the incumbent are different, but the result feels a lot like that. Otherwise, an election where there's just a lot of discontent that ends up.
You mentioned malaise, and so 1980 comes to mind.
1980 comes to mind, right.
And another reason there, too, is that there's a lot of good news, no prediction, and I'm not an economist, but lots of good news recently about inflation, and then certainly lots of good news for the Carter administration with the end of the hostage crisis after he's already lost the election, and similar thing could be happening here as well.
Right, it's so much of presidential politics in terms of your legacy is just pure luck, right? To go back to FDR, the Depression. So the Depression is in 1929. The crash is in 1929. The Depression really takes hold in the next fiscal quarter after that. By the time Roosevelt takes office, if you were to look at a chart of unemployment, the United States has already moved past the lowest point of the Depression. We're kind of on the upswing. And so it's not as if FDR did nothing, but he was able to take advantage of the fact that we were in the beginning of a recovery, and you could juice the recovery. So you take office after everything's gotten very bad, everything looks pretty good. If you take office as things are getting terrible, then you may find yourself holding the bag, right? Because you may not have been able to do enough to create a strong recovery. You may be finishing your term just at the beginning of the recovery, or there's still further to fall. And I think Biden, him being unlucky, is that he took office before inflation began and rode out the inflationary wave, and is going to leave office as that inflationary wave subsides. And it's just a bad position for an incumbent to be in.
What is Biden's legacy?
Biden ran into 2020 promising to kind of put Trump in the past, and Trump is very much not in the past. And so that's his legacy, right? His legacy is that the one thing he really ran on, which was not just pandemic recovery, but getting past the Trump era, he wasn't able to do. He wasn't able to keep Trump at bay. Neither he nor his vice president. So I think that has to be Biden's legacy. I think Biden's economic management, his legislative accomplishments will pale in comparison to his inability to keep Trump out. And I would say as well that his decision to fully commit to Israel's war in Gaza will probably stand next to that as well. And I would imagine the future historians are going to talk about these things in tandem as not two sides of the same coin, but two parts of the same failure.
Let's go back to January 2021. Trump is persona non grata nationally, has left office. January 6th has just happened. A few Republicans are making pilgrimages to Mar-a-Lago, so it's not as if he's completely out to pasture, but his perch is no longer as high in American politics. Biden is ascendant. Maybe he's claiming a mandate, but he doesn't have one because that's a social construct. In any case, he's won a pretty sizable majority, even if it was close in the Electoral College with this and that vote in Georgia and elsewhere. What could the Democrats have done differently to set themselves up for a different result in this election?
So my inclination, I'm going to tell you my thought process just then. My inclination is to say that the ball was in the court of the Republican Party, that had Republican leaders in the Senate said, vote to convict in the impeachment trial, then that would have been it, right? That would have been the game.
Yeah.
Trump would have been ineligible to run for office again, and Nikki Haley would have become the nominee, and we'd be talking about the incoming Haley administration. The only other option, barring Republicans agreeing to impeach Trump and removing him, would have been the Biden administration opening a criminal case against him day one, essentially, over January 6th, and seeing where that went, and having a full 4 years for that criminal case or rather, the Biden administration, Attorney General Merrick Garland appointing a special prosecutor to open a criminal case against Trump for Jan 6th and everything leading up to it. In the absence of either of those things, I kind of think that Trump coming back was, what they call overdetermined. It was so many different things are pointing in that direction that you had to have anticipated, in the absence of any constraints on him, that he would try to run again. Which, to me, if I were to tell, of the many stories you can tell of the Trump era in American politics, one of the things that I find so striking is that at every single stage of it, there have been these moments where it was entirely possible to put him out to pasture. So in 2015, Republicans running for president, all 40 of them, could have essentially decided, a bunch of us are going to drop out, right? A bunch of us we have no chance. We're going to drop out. We're going to go behind Jeb or Marco or Chris Christie. One of these guys is going to be the guy, and they'll go toe-to-toe with Trump. And early on enough, that might have been enough to beat him. Because at no point in that Republican primary did Trump ever clear more than a third of the vote until pretty late in the process, until it was pretty clear he was going to win. So Republicans dropped the ball in 2015. In 2016, you have all kinds of figures across political and civil society essentially saying, well, Hillary Clinton's probably going to win, so we can kind of either position ourselves to show our independence from Clinton, or you don't really have to worry about Trump. He's going to lose. She's going to take care of it for us.
Including Jim Comey.
Including Jim Comey. And then that doesn't happen. He wins, right. And we move on into his administration, where there is this, the law will take care of him. The legal system will take care of him. Someone else will do this thing.
Bob Mueller.
To take care of him, and we don't have to make political choices about trying to confront him. This is his opponents. And so his opponents kind of consistently make this calculation that you don't have to confront him directly. He's so, dysfunctional that things are going to fall apart of their own volition. And it's a fundamentally flawed calculation, because the fact of the matter is that he is a skilled and gifted politician, right? This is a true thing. People want to believe that he is dumb and incapable, and there are certainly things for which, I would not ask Donald Trump to explain, the necessary and proper clause in the Constitution. I don't think he's heard of it. And I'm not saying that to insult the guy. I think even if you're a fan, you have to admit he probably hasn't heard of the necessary and proper clause of the Constitution. But he does have these other skills that are very potent and very powerful, and have given him kind of 2 terms in the White House and full control of a political party. And his opponents, it seems, throughout his time, have just not taken that seriously.
Let's talk about Trump, since you brought him up. Let's talk about Trump. And what I'm interested in is the nation's difficulty to really categorize him in the way that we relate to him, including fans, which is that for many he is attention-seeking, and for others he is a kind of media mastermind. For others he is off the cuff and unscripted, and others he is strategically playing a political chess game that few people are understanding the chess moves that he's making. And so on the one hand, you mentioned the sort of buffoonery, and on the other hand, that is just the show act that he learned from professional wrestling, but really there is a kind of secret genius to the madness. You talked about his political skill and his obvious staying power. Let's just stay on the political skill for a moment in terms of the way that he enraptures those folks who really adore him and seem to adore him despite any scandal, right? There's no low for Trump. As he famously said, he could shoot somebody on Fifth Avenue or Madison Avenue and kind of get away with it.
Right.
So talk about the way in which he has a hold on folks and his political skill as a speaker first, and then we'll move to sort of bigger strategic moves.
So I'll say I don't necessarily think he's a secret genius, but I do think that he has a powerful kind of what's called personalist appeal to a lot of voters. And I mean, something of the thing that I find a little amusing is that often people will struggle to categorize Trump. But if you take a step back away from national political history and just look at urban history in the United States, the kinds of figures that come to power in our cities, there are a lot of Trump-like figures. I lived in Washington, D.C. for almost a decade. Our mayor, not while I was there, but for some time, was Marion Barry, who people would if you watched him in action, if you observed him, if you observed the staying power, the way that people were committed to him, the way that he could be caught smoking crack in a hotel room, and voters would say, yeah, but he's still for us, right? Like, It's the exact same dynamic. You could even call Trump like white Marion Barry if you wanted to.
I'm sure he would adore that.
But there are other figures like that. Frank Rizzo in Philadelphia, the Dailies in Chicago, right? Like urban machines have like consistently produced figures like this. These figures, and it makes sense. Just the politics of a city, of an urban machine. It's the mayor is this focal point. They are directly delivering services to often sometimes individual voters. It's a very direct and personal connection. And it privileges a kind of style of politics that would be familiar in, say, Latin America, right? The caudillo politics of these, kind of men on horseback figures who have these direct personal connections with like the broad working classes. And that's just Donald Trump. And it's refracted through mass media. The kind of direct personal connection is forged through, this kind of this parasocial relationship. But it's the same kind of thing, the same kind of almost participatory relationship. You wear the hat, you go to the rally, you're a part of something in a way that is more than just a transaction in the voting booth. And it's these urban political figures. They don't lose, right? Like they hold on. They run cities for as long as they can. And so if you imagine Trump as sort of the urban boss gone national, he's entirely legible. He makes complete sense. You can think of other political antecedents, right? Like Huey Long in Louisiana is very similar. Here in South Carolina, you have Ben Tillman, governor and senator in the late 20th and early 19th century, or rather late 19th and early 20th century. But he's a type, Trump. And I think the thing that maybe makes him mystifying to observers is that this kind of type has never succeeded on the level of national politics, in part because the ability, it seemed difficult to build that kind of direct personal relationship across space the way you can in a singular, geographically bounded area. But this is where social media comes in. This is where mass media comes in. This is where all these things come in to make it possible.
Who are some national political figures? They don't necessarily have to be electoral figures, although that's certainly helpful, who, in your mind, historically mimic Trump, these kind of antecedents to Trump.
A good friend of mine has a book, When the Clock Broke, about the politics of the early 90s, and he looks to Ross Perot as a somewhat similar figure, not the same, but somewhat similar, to John Gotti as kind of not a political figure, but certainly a cultural figure. And honestly, you can look at Donald Trump as like, what if John Gotti became president? But George Wallace is another one in the 1960s. These sorts of figures are part of American political history. And I think they can help us make sense of the dynamics that both produce Trump and that like give him his staying power. But they also, I think, point to maybe one of the contradictions of all of this within the Trump movement, which is that because it's so personalist, because it's so tied to this particular person, when he leaves the scene, whenever that is, will it be replicated? Can it be replicated by someone who doesn't come into it with the same kind of background, skills, long pre-political career, kind of well-established persona, all these things?
Yeah.
Can someone replicate it? And what's interesting about the election results is that there were candidates on the ballot in several states that were Trump-like figures.
Mark Robinson
in North Carolina, Kerry Lake in Arizona, and they could not do it. And consistently, candidates who try to do that for governor, for senator, for House rep, they can never accomplish the same thing.
That's right. And so it sort of returns to the question of how is he able to operate by a different accountability or punishability framework than are others? Like, what is the kind of magic connection that happens between him and media and between him and his supporters that other folks just can't seem to take advantage of?
Again, I think it's partly that he is not simply someone utilizing mass media, social media, but is really of it, right? Like he is. The Dark Knight Rises isn't too old at this point, right? Like he was like born in the darkness, kind of thing. He just comes directly out of this and is native to the medium, you might say, in a way that isn't true of, I think, the people who are trying to mimic him. I'd say also this comes to the importance of political parties, right? Someone like Joseph McCarthy could not last because eventually Eisenhower turned on him. Eventually the Republican Party turned on him, and that was the reason why he lost. Not lost, but he became a figure of ill repute. But the Republican Party has stuck with Trump throughout, and has not really broken with him in any meaningful way. And that is a powerful thing. Most voters, they vote their party affiliation.
Yeah.
Like 90% of voters vote their party affiliation, and that alone can explain his staying power. If the institutional Republican Party is going to stick with Trump, if they're not really going to contest his party leadership, then regular voters aren't going to either.
Let's talk a bit about Obama's legacy as well, as we're talking about the kind of precedents for this leading up to Biden's election and Trump's election. There was so much made in 2008 and 2012 of the Obama coalition, young people, people of color, college-educated folks, as this kind of core demographic. The Republican Party was doing autopsies in 2008 and 2012, talking about how if we don't expand our base and be nicer to specific groups of people, we'll lose elections in perpetuity. And the idea there was that demography was destiny, right? What remains of that coalition, and do we now see a new and different coalition ascendant on the Trump side, on the red state side?
I think that in the moment of Obama, the argument that there was this perhaps permanent Democratic majority was not true, that it was mistaken, and I think it's only become more so in the years since. I think you can look at the Obama coalition as maybe not representing some kind of exception, but like one particular moment, united around one especially charismatic figure. Yeah. It's sort of noteworthy, right, that in the 16 years since 2008, Obama won twice, and the only Democrat to win since was his vice president, right? So it's to me, it's an indication that coalition was short-lived and fragile, and that the Republican coalition wasn't as doomed as it appeared to be. And what we've seen, right, are these like important shifts that there was precedent for prior, right? George Bush in 2004 won about like 40% of the Latino vote in that election, and Donald Trump is on track to win about like 46%. So Trump compared to Mitt Romney, huge improvement among Latino voters. But compared to Bush, it's a modest improvement. And what happened with Obama, was it that Latinos were suddenly becoming part of this Obama coalition? Or was it just sort of like this uniquely charismatic figure in conditions that were very favorable to a Democratic candidate, and there's a general swing in the Democratic Party's direction, and as those conditions have faded away, as new voters have entered the electorate, as people have had new experiences, as they relate to political figures in different ways, there's just like a natural shift, a natural change.
Yeah.
Donald Trump, for example, is this figure who in American, national imagination has represented wealth, has represented prosperity, has represented entrepreneurial success, and is it really that much of a surprise that for a lot of working class voters who want economic security, who want entrepreneurial success, they look at Trump and they say, I want someone like that representing the country.
Yeah.
Again, I think it's useful whenever you're thinking about national politics to maybe engage in a little abstraction. Just sort of imagine that the people aren't the people and just attach to them their characteristics and qualities. And then ask yourself, does this make sense or not? And I think if you just pretend that Donald Trump is not Donald Trump, that he's just like a generic Republican, but he has this set of qualities and meanings attached to him, and ask yourself, would voters be attracted to this? I think you'd have to conclude, well, yes, they would.
Yeah.
And under the right conditions, background conditions, the fundamental conditions, that candidate's going to win.
What do you expect from a Trump presidency? Obviously, he's going to claim this mandate, as all incoming presidents do. He's going to have some legitimacy in that, given the immediate results, surprising to many people. He talked about a lot of different policy options, sort of one a day in the weave, as he calls it, as he would speak off the cuff to many. So he was talking about no taxes on tips and no taxes on overtime. The sort of consistent refrain was deportation and tariffs, and perhaps settling some grievances from the first Trump administration. And then, so there's the question of, like, what do you expect, but then also, what is he claiming a mandate for? Because many of his voters take him seriously, but not literally, whereas those on the left think of it as the opposite, right? Literally, but not seriously. And so, what do you expect from the incoming Trump administration?
I tend to take everything presidential candidates say, like, both literally and seriously. There's good reason to do this. There's a lot of very good research on why presidential campaign promises are reliable guides to what presidents do. That was true, I think, of the first Trump campaign. I have to imagine it's going to be true of this Trump campaign. You gotta divide everything maybe into three buckets. The first is things that the president can do mostly unilaterally because of existing legal authority. You got things that have to be done by Congress because Congress has the primary authority. And then you have things that the president and Congress are going to want to do together. So tariffs and deportations can mostly be done using unilateral executive authority because of past statutes that give the president that kind of discretion. So President Trump can use existing resources that the Department of Homeland Security has, that Customs and Border Patrol has, that ICE has, to supercharge, speed up deportations. If the president wants to, and it's worth just kind of getting a little bit in the weeds here of the practical aspect of this, there actually isn't physically enough capacity to hold more than about 50,000 detained immigrants at a time for processing, and there aren't enough ICE and border agents to deport more than maybe a couple 100,000 people in a year. And so if there's no law passed to fund a vast new expansion of deportation authority and ability, then he can pursue it unilaterally, but it's not going to be as expansive, right, as he's promised. And so we'll have to see. We'll have to see if Congress wants to go in for this, because in order to figure out how much money you have to spend, you have to do real research into what it's going to take. And as you get into that process, people might get cold feet, right? So we'll see. But I do expect the administration to attempt some aggressive deportation actions kind of immediately. The tariffs I expect to happen, again, these are something the president can impose unilaterally, and I expect them to happen. How long they'll last, how long, and whether there'll be loopholes are all separate questions, but
Yeah, they'll be challenged in court, I imagine, as well.
these are the two things that he's been consistent about, and I think you reliably should assume that he'll do. The tax policy, that's kind of Congress's ball. And there's already indications that Congress is sort of like, well, I don't know about this no tax on tips. I don't know about this no tax on overtime, right? You already have Republican leaders at the relevant committees in the House and Senate saying, well, we'll look at these proposals. We'll see what we're going to do. The Trump tax cuts from 2017 are up for renewal this next year. And so those will likely go through it. That'll be like a big, $3-4 trillion tax cut, kind of geared towards upper income, with some benefits for lower income and middle-class voters. That'll likely go through, but the rest of it I'm not entirely sure. Also, there may be a Democratic majority in the House. I mean, we don't know. It's still a possibility. Even if there's a Republican one, it may be like a one-seat Republican majority. And I just was reading this morning that Trump wants at least Stefanik from New York to be his UN ambassador. So if that happens, the House might be 217. So there's a chance that no legislation happens, right? Because there just isn't a workable House majority to make it happen. To the extent that there is a workable House majority and there are things Congress and the president wants to do, that's all going to be appointments, right? And so I think we should count on the most durable result of this being just a solidified conservative majority on the Supreme Court. If Sonia Sotomayor, Elena Kagan, or Justice Jackson, for whatever reason, are no longer on the court between now and January 21st, 2029, that might look like a 7-2 Supreme Court. But either way, the Supreme Court will likely have 5 of its 9 members appointed by Donald Trump, because Sam Alito and Clarence Thomas are likely to retire during the next 4 years. So that's what I kind of anticipate, and kind of the range of outcomes is pretty wide here. And I think it's also just worth, remembering that during the first Trump administration, it wasn't as if this was smooth sailing for 4 years, right? There was a lot of conflict and drama and chaos and controversies and all these things constantly during those 4 years. Yeah. And it's also not as if, the first Trump administration was staffed by a lot of people who you would just expect to be in any Republican administration. The second Trump administration is not going to have those people. And so I think there's just a real question about how effective the administration is going to be, whether Congress is really going to play along, and to what extent that it will, and how, the midterms are in 2026, what the public response to all of this looks like.
Last question from me, and then we're going to pivot to our audience. So I'd love for those of y'all who want to ask questions to start thinking up questions you'd like to ask to Jamelle. Last question from me is a little bit more personal, a little bit more local. I direct an organization on campus called the Civility Initiative. I'm very interested in the practice of civility. You're a prominent national political columnist and commentator. Is civility something you think about in terms of the way that you do your writing and when you do appearances on Face the Nation and wherever else? And if so, what are the kinds of norms that you try to practice as you engage people in political arguments?
I do think of civility, but I don't think of it in terms of being nice, I guess. Yeah. I think of it in terms of what obligations do I have to a person I'm speaking to or an audience, right? I'm obligated to be as truthful as I can, to be as honest as I can, to speak and act in good faith, not say things I don't really believe, to not be disingenuous, to be intellectually honest. And if in the course of doing those things, maybe I'm a little aggressive, maybe I'm a little bit abrasive, I don't count that as being incivil. I think incivility is approaching the people that you're engaged in dialogue with as if they're stupid, as if they're dumb, as if you can pull one over on them, as if you can treat them as people who are not individuals with their own views and perspectives who can be persuaded or reasoned with, but people whom you can just dominate over by telling lies or being dishonest with them or so on and so forth. So as long as I think am again trying to be as honest and truthful and forthright as possible, that to me is being civil with someone, even if, you know, I have a strong disagreement, even if that strong disagreement, I mean, I don't like raise my voice or anything. It's not like I'm yelling at anyone, but even if that strong disagreement gets a little contentious, as long as it is, as I'm facing the other person as if they are essentially an equal who I am reasoning with and not trying to dominate, then I think that's civility to me.
Well said. I would love to hear from y'all. Where are our microphones at? We have runners. We have a question here, please. And you've got a microphone coming at you. Hey.
Can you hear me?
We can hear you.
We
I'm
can
not
hear
sure if
you.
others can, though. Go ahead. Go ahead, Jamelle.
I think this is where it gets, like the point I made earlier about the electorate being kind of a broad and diverse thing, this is where I think that comes in, because I think that there are probably a lot of voters who probably agree with you about Trump's character. I just read an interview with a voter in Pennsylvania who said, this is verbatim, I'm not making this up. This voter said, I think he's like Hitler, but I voted for him. And I think you can find a lot of voters who do not see Donald Trump as a particularly virtuous person, who voted for him anyway because they see perhaps his lack of virtue as being a necessary thing. They maybe perceive the world as being dangerous, and you need someone who's maybe a little crazy at the top for whatever reason. Maybe they say, yes, he's not particularly virtuous. Yes, he is a person of poor morals, but he is good at getting the economy going, and what I really care about is the money in my pocket. And so I think when it comes to being in community with people, I think part of the challenge is first not assuming that everyone who voted for him views him as like a good person, but trying to get to the bottom of why there's this disconnect between personal morality and virtue and then politics. Trying to understand that disconnect. Because from my perspective, and this would have been the perspective of the framers of the Constitution, the Founding Fathers, right, that you can't separate the two. That a person who is selfish in their personal life may have a hard time being selfless when leadership demands a certain amount of selflessness, may have a hard time looking beyond their immediate political needs to do what is necessary when governing a large country of people, half of whom didn't vote for you, right, and don't like you, but you still have an obligation to them as the leader of the country. So I don't see the easy separation between the two things that I think a lot of voters do, but a lot of voters do see this easy separation. And so when it comes to being in community with voters who made a choice that you disagree with, I think it's probably important to understand the disconnect, and if you're trying to persuade them, using your understanding of the disconnect to maybe begin to make a case, make an argument, guide them to your perspective. But I do think it's worth just keeping in mind that a good chunk of people who voted for Donald Trump do not like him. And a good chunk of people who voted against Kamala Harris did like her quite a bit. And I think the key to understanding this election, or one of the keys, will be understanding that exact dynamic.
Yeah, and one of the things I'd share too, just in civility norms of peace building stuff along the lines of not stereotyping Trump voters as Trumpists, is that in poll after poll after poll, it said that who has the most favorability ratings, say Harris wins. Who has competence issues, Harris wins. Who's the most likely change agent of the two candidates? Trump wins over and over and over again. So you get this guy in Pennsylvania who's like, well, maybe I just voted for Hitler, but I also just voted for Hitler. And staying in relationship with folks, hearing people out, understanding that our beliefs do different things for us, and so humanizing the possibility of disagreement, and then not getting trapped in factual disputes or disputes about Trump's character, but working backwards from finding common values with people, whether that's equality or safe communities or justice or whatever that common value is, and then we work back to a more just, more equitable society from there and stay out of, is Trump good or bad? What are his influences? What does this policy do or not do? Because it's a fun house of mirrors. It's an excellent question and so well said, and a worthy act to follow. Please, another one.
First of all, thank you so much for visiting the college. It's been amazing to listen to you speak, and we're so thankful to have you here. But earlier on in the discussion, it was said that global trends pointed towards political leaders being elected in opposition to the party that was in power after the pandemic. I was wondering why it wouldn't be in opposition to the parties that were in power before the pandemic, as I would expect people to put blame on those who were associated with the pandemic being ushered in, or sort of like how we view wars, blaming the people who get us into wars, or during wars, not blaming the people who deal with the aftermath of it.
That's a great question, and I think part of it in the United States, at least, is that I think a lot of Americans do not perceive the pandemic as being the product of like discrete policy choices, right? They don't see it as the president made a bunch of bad choices, therefore we weathered the pandemic in a bad way. I think it's perceived as something more like the weather. You shouldn't blame a political party for the weather. I'm not going to say you can't. People can do lots of things. But voters see the pandemic, see all of that as just sort of, it's a thing that happened to us all, and Trump bears no responsibility for the fact that it happened. Which, I'll say is a little unusual, if only because typically the measure of a president is how they handle crisis. No one builds statues to the president who was president when things were just like going all right, Everyone, people love Dwight Eisenhower. Eisenhower, great president, but no one ranks Eisenhower in like the top 5, not because he wasn't good at the job, but because nothing happened, right? It was the 1950s, general prosperity. There weren't any big crises. He took office after the Korean War, so he wasn't even a wartime president. He was Ike, and people thought he was pretty cool. But he's not held in esteem. The presidents we hold in esteem, Lincoln, FDR, Washington, like these are people who either had some fundamental crisis or we're leading the country in like unprecedented times or something like that. And that's who we hold in esteem. So one would think that Trump mishandling the pandemic would read as a president mishandling a crisis. Then again, there hadn't been a pandemic like this in 100 years. And one thing that is actually kind of interesting is that Woodrow Wilson, who was president as the Spanish flu took hold, and then was Warren Harding, who took over, neither of those men saw any particular hit to their popularity or standing as a result of the Spanish flu. And in fact, by 3 or 4 years after it, the public was like, this wasn't a thing that happened. We're going to forget about it. And that actually just might be how societies react to like mass disease, not in dwelling over what happened, but trying to forget it as quickly as possible and moving on. I will say, the last thing I'll say here is that interestingly, Biden did suffer as a result of ending a war. Doing the withdrawal from Afghanistan appears to have been like a permanent hit to Joe Biden's popularity. And that is also an interesting thing. And it's, politicians take lessons from people who held the office in the past. And that might, a lesson, American presidents might take going forward, is try very hard not to be the one to end a war. Which would hopefully be try very hard not to start wars, but, I'm not going to hold my breath.
Please, right in front, and then I'll come over to y'all two next. Go ahead, right, you.
Sorry. If you want to come out to the aisle.
Hi there.
Hello.
Man, I'm a lot more nervous than I was like 5 seconds ago. But anyway, I wanted to know what is the deal with sort of the Democratic tendency to spend so much time and effort reaching across the aisle and trying to pull from the other party and sort of like, as you said, lose big. Why are they afraid to go like left and, really like back their supporters' beliefs? Like, why do they spend so much time like reaching across the aisle, and why are they like afraid to use that sort of executive, unilateral authoritative power that you mentioned to really enact change? Why do they feel so stagnant? And yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. There are two questions there. One's kind of electoral, one's sort of when it comes to governing. When it comes to the electoral question, it appears that the theory of kind of Democratic strategists for the past decade have been that there aren't enough votes on the left side of the ledger in key swing states to win. And so the only way to get enough votes is to appeal to sort of moderates, independents, people in the middle who say that they like compromise, they don't like extremes, so on and so forth. I think it's clear at this point that this sort of theory of the case is wrong, because not because there aren't moderates, because there aren't independents, but because I don't think that is the axis on which voters are actually making the decisions. I think voters are looking more at things like, is this person an outsider? Do they kind of represent my own discontent or anger with kind of the status quo? Like, these are the sorts of things, and it's very non-ideological. I think that if you had a very moderate politician who sounded angry all the time, that person would clean up, right? Like, that person would just do incredibly well. Because it isn't about the specific policy, it's about the attitude and the affect. Or put it maybe a little differently, there are policies that kind of communicate that kind of discontent, right? If you say, I want to raise taxes on billionaires, and you say it like really angrily, people respond to that in a way that they don't respond to, I want to increase capital gains taxes. Like that doesn't read as anything to anyone. And so I think Democrats have this theory that if you can calibrate the right set of policies and speak to people in the middle who have these moderate views, then you'll get those voters and win. And what they're missing is that this is much more emotional. This is much more about affect. This is much more about feeling than it is about anything really concrete, which is a little funny because that to me is just politics. I spent a lot of time reading about 19th century American history, and that is a time when political life was done in these big emotions. It wasn't here's my policy for deflating the currency. It was the Democrats are the party of rum, Romanism, and rebellion, and you shouldn't vote for them, right? That was the message. It was Republicans saying, or Democrats saying, the Republicans are a party of Eastern business elites who want to crucify you on a cross of gold. Now, if a candidate today went on CNN and said, the Republicans want to crucify you on a cross of gold, it'd be like a huge scandal. But I'm not sure voters would respond in a negative way because they would be taking in the feeling and not so much thinking about the message. When it comes to, which I think Trump understands. Trump understands this. The problem is I think you should also take seriously what people say and the literal words. So something like mass deportations now communicates a certain feeling, but it also is like a policy objective that people want to accomplish, and you can't separate the two. When it comes to governing, I actually think this is like a pretty fundamental difference between Republicans and Democrats when it comes to their objectives. Democrats do want to make big changes to the social safety net, right? They want expanded health care, maybe even universal health care if they're Democrats that are on the left. They want universal child care. They want, child tax credit. They want all these things. And the structure of the American system is that the only way you can accomplish these things is with a vote of Congress. Congress has to tell the federal treasury you're going to spend this money on these things and then tell the executive to do it, which means the Democratic program is primarily legislative. The Republican program, which is often tax cuts, deregulation, and judicial, conservative judges, is not as legislative. You don't need Congress to tell the EPA to be more lenient on enforcing carbon emissions, right? You don't need Congress to say to the Department of Health and Human Services, be more strict when it comes to determining Medicaid eligibility, because that's discretion that the executive has. You don't need both chambers of Congress to confirm a judge, right? You just need 50 votes in the Senate, basically, and you can confirm a judge to any federal judgeship. And even tax cuts through congressional rules, you only really need the barest majority in both houses to pass a big tax cut, and then you don't have to do really anything else legislatively. And so I think it's just it's the nature of the Republican Party's aims that they just don't have to rely as much on straight legislation and can act unilaterally to accomplish a lot of things. And Democrats don't necessarily have that same, they're not in the same position. There are things they can do through executive action. Though I'll say real quick, as just kind of a parenthetical, the use of executive action this way is quite new. It's pretty novel. It showed up basically in the past 25 years. But prior to that, I was just watching this documentary about LBJ. A thing one does when you're just hanging out at home, you watch 6-hour documentaries about presidents, but that's what I was doing. And it was striking to hear Johnson's first year after his election described, where Congress is just like passing bill after bill after bill, just like a dozen bills in a couple months. That used to be how things were done. It wasn't the executive saying, I'm going to interpret the law in this idiosyncratic way to get this result. It was just the president going to Congress, I think you should pass a bill to fund early childhood education. And then Congress says, okay, I guess we'll do that. And then they pass the bill and it happens. And I would say, if I'm going to take like a macro picture and a like just not thinking about the who's in office or whatever, I think it's probably a bad thing on the balance that Congress is so sluggish and unwilling to do anything. And I think it's bad for the stability of policy. It's bad for people's expectations of what presidents can do. That we all kind of say, well, what can the president do unilaterally, when that's just not how the system's supposed to work. That doesn't excuse inaction, but I think we should want a Congress that's like much more active and much more aggressive about its own authority. And we should want to be less reliant on what the president can do with a stroke of their pen.
I think we have time for at least 2 more questions, and I saw both of y'all over there. Would you go ahead first in the front row? Yeah, looking at you in the striped.
Okay, so one of the things that you were talking about, which was the coalition, the Latin community, and I've helped with the Biden campaign along with down here. We also had Kamala here as well. And so with that being said, we really did try to gear towards a community, right, in a sense, right? And I think one of the biggest issues on media is that when we think about terms, right, when in my sociology class, we had to close our eyes, and he gave us a word, which was image a thug. And what do we image as a thug, right? We associate it with something or someone, right? And as long as we keep talking about immigration and associating it only to the Latin community, it just seems as though that we're just losing voters in that sense, because we're just making them inhumane in that sense, right? And so I'm Hmong. And Hmong people, we're also somewhat immigrants as well. So you have other communities who are also immigrants, but why do we disregard that? Is that a media issue, or was that the fact that that was a lack of unification that Kamala missed during her campaign that maybe Obama was able to do to be able to gain those votes? And so I guess my question to you was, is it effective to be able to target minority groups to be able to gain votes? Or obviously in this instance, it just seemed like the Israel and Palestine, she just kind of geared it away. And so, sorry.
Yeah. I think that the theory, so I think in the world of democratic politics, which is not just structured by candidates, but by outside groups, by activist groups, by all kinds of things, there's been, over the last decade or so, the influence of groups representing particular communities of immigrants have been like really strong. And so that's sort of structured how Democrats have thought of what an immigrant appeal is. And I think that what's been missed is first the sheer diversity of immigrant groups in the United States, the sheer diversity of political perspectives within immigrant groups, right? There are plenty of people in the country that have immigrated to the United States fleeing governments that they did not trust to do the right thing, and so they come to the United States. And is it then a big surprise that some of them may not trust the U.S. government, trust a political candidate saying, I want to do stuff for you on behalf of the government? They might say, that doesn't fit with my experience, and I don't really trust that. Those sorts of dynamics, I think, have been missed in how Democrats have thought about immigrant communities and thought about immigrant outreach. I also think, it's funny, the Trump campaign both did really intense narrow targeting at specific demographics, right? Like whenever people talk about identity politics, they talk about it in the context of Democrats, but like this was a very identity-centric campaign from the Trump campaign. But at the same time, the semiotics of Trump, the symbols and ideas and notions around Trump that tend to, he represents kind of entrepreneurism, and he represents wealth, and he represents success. That also sent a broader-based message that kind of overlapped with the intense targeting to, I think, appeal to a lot of people in a lot of different groups. It was like this weirdly broad, really weirdly narrow and broad message simultaneously. It wasn't just, I'm going to give you a thing, I'm gonna do this for you, but also, don't you want to be a part of this larger thing as well? And I don't think Democrats have any kind of message like that. I'll put it this way, I don't think Democrats have like a story to tell about the country. Trump has a story to tell about the country. It's, I'm rich and I'll make you rich. And it's, you are suffering because someone has gotten over on you, and I will get over on them on your behalf. I will get over on immigrants on your behalf. I will get over on elites in Washington on your behalf. It's like a coherent story that I think fits with people's feelings, right? They go to the grocery store and they see that a carton of strawberries is $7 and not $4, and they feel like someone has gotten over on them. And Trump kind of gets that and communicates that. And there's no competing Democratic story here about the world, about conditions, about who is to blame for things going wrong. And I think until Democrats figure out a way to tell a story and not just offer a bunch of policies, they're going to be at a disadvantage. Because I think ultimately it doesn't quite matter that much what the policies are. What people want is some kind of story. And I'll go back to Obama, like the last really truly successful Democratic candidate for president. Obama had a story, which is that, aren't you tired of how terrible things are, and I embody a big change, a big generational leap forward, and you can vote for me, and you will be a part of this leap forward that will make things better. And no one's had a story on the Democratic side that I think is necessarily as compelling as that one was to a lot of voters. There's one more question over there.
Yeah, one more, and I saw you in the back. Yes, please, thank you. And this is a quick one because we're almost out of time.
Realistically, I wanted to know what kind of changes we should expect from healthcare with the new administration, but specifically the Affordable Care Act. And honestly, for people who are on like insurance funded by the government, should they be scared if they can't afford private insurance?
This will come down to what Congress will want to do. In terms of executive action, during the previous Trump administration, there was a real effort to reduce or to make it a little more difficult to get insurance in the Obamacare exchanges, and the administration gave out waivers to states to allow them to do work requirements in Medicaid and that kind of thing, to kind of reduce eligibility and reduce the rolls. But for any kind of like big change, like big reversion or any kind, you'd have to have Congress do something. And it's sort of unclear what a Republican Congress would want to do. The last time they tried to repeal Obamacare, it did not work out. There was a big backlash, and it likely contributed to their defeats in 2018. And the other thing is that the Affordable Care Act was passed in 2010. It kind of went online in 2011. It's been well over a decade, right? Like this isn't the case of the insurance companies and the hospitals and everyone are still trying to figure out the rules, and then you could change the law real quick, and then they can just revert back to the way it was. The rules are the way the rules are. There are certain expectations. Parents expect to be able to keep their kids from health insurance until they're 25. People expect that there aren't lifetime maximums anymore. People expect that you can't lose your health insurance because of a pre-existing condition. And so I don't really know what Congress is going to do with regards to the Affordable Care Act and which is the big healthcare change of the past decade. I don't know what they'll do about Medicaid. The Medicaid expansion has covered tens of millions of people around the country. A bunch of states, like North Carolina, just did its Medicaid expansion. Like, I don't know if all these states that are relying on federal Medicaid funds to not overwhelm their hospitals, right? Like, you lose these funds in some of these states, you lose your rural hospitals. Like, it isn't just an ideological game, it's like actual consequences that may cost people their elections. I mean, set their lives aside. People might lose elections. And politicians want nothing more than to win elections. So I honestly don't know. I think that when it comes to Medicare, there is a chance, especially if we get the big tax cuts that the president-elect has promised, both the cutting taxes on tips and on overtime and on Social Security benefits, all these things, that would be such a decline in revenue that you'd have to make cuts to Medicare, which is one of the largest kind of cost centers in the federal government. Like the federal government is basically an army, Social Security, and Medicare, and like everything else is like pennies on the dollar. And so if you're losing a lot of revenue, something has to get cut. It's probably not going to be the military, and it'd have to be Social Security and Medicare. And so we'll see if that happens. But again, that would be ruinously unpopular. So I don't know. My honest answer is I don't know. It's like too early to say what they want to do. The speaker had said last week, yeah, we're gonna repeal Obamacare, and then as soon as someone asked him again, he's like, I didn't say that. You're imagining things. So we'll see. And of course, if Democrats win the House, then it becomes all a moot point, right? Like that's not going to happen. But yeah, I don't know.
On that note, on behalf of the Department of Communication, the Civility Initiative, thank you, Jamelle Bouie, for being here. Thank you all for coming out and listening to us talk. Much appreciated. We'll see everybody very soon. Have a wonderful night.